Hello everyone, today we talk about 14th century Poland for our historical regional series. I already made something about 15th century Poland and Lithuania, and I don't know how or why I sort of skipped 14th century Poland. I usually go in chronological order, and these are sort of big chapters about the major European monarchies that it's a bit difficult to miss, step by step. But we also have, as you know, to cover lots of different, even sort of minor areas of Europe that deserve that sort of historical attention, perhaps even more in a sense, because nobody ever discusses them. In fact, I was about to pass to a sort of like to the Polish provinces rather than, of course, the broader Polish kingdom. That is a relatively obscure topic. At least you hardly find anything on YouTube about that. And is that I have enough material to make a pretty interesting series about, which I think is relevant. Of course, we're looking at Central Europe, and as you can imagine, we know, generally speaking, less, even more east, like in this case. But given the overall political fragmentation of Poland during different times, and the overall sort of heading of the country towards some more oligarchic profile, those areas are quite important. And that's why I notice, however, that we miss 14th century Polish history. By the way, it's very important because actually witnesses a power reconcentration, right? Which exactly in a moment in which the rest of Europe was actually not going through such things. Some say it's because Poland was not apparently much affected by the plague. There are a couple of reasons that is cast here and there. By the way, it's not the first video we make, of course, about 14th century Poland. It happened also for some other dives that we make about Polish history. And in fact, we will look at not tremendously new times, just tremendously new information, especially in a comprehensive sense. Here I made a video about, Polish social, economic, demographic, urban, and cultural development under Casimir III. I thought we had made more, telling you the truth. Europa Jagiellonica, which is of the 15th century, of course. 13th century Poland. Well, that's good. That's the signal that really needed this. So, of course, it's going to be a general overview on the country's history. It doesn't pretend to be a particularly complete thing. But by YouTube standards, of course, we're doing the most in-depth thing that is probably out there about 14th century Poland. So Vladislav I, the Elbow High, and his son Casimir III, dubbed the Great, are the last two monarchs of the PS dynasty. Right, this great ancestral house that had essentially parceled out to the various branches of the clan, the Polish kingdom, through a system of princely seigniorate that eventually had evolved probably into a fully fledged kingdom. The last Piasts are actually witnessing to this recompaction, thanks to their doings as well. Vladislav I and Casimir III's governance did not fully revive the Polish state to its condition prior to the era of fragmentation, which was in part also nominally unitary rather than more concretely, governmentally. Internal unity and territorial wellness were compromised now from quite a while, and already the fact that probably a Polish power emerged so well outlined, historically speaking, from Central Europe is a sort of marvel to behold. I mean, there are some broader reasons. This is to the merit of Poland. Obviously, it's not a critique. And there are, however, particular dynamics through which this happens that are worth considering. Local PS princes held considerable authority, and due to different, say, economic or cultural influences, some aligned themselves with neighboring powers, trying to maintain their own peripheral, in fact, liberties from what normally was the Principality, the Duchy of Krakow, that was chosen as the capital of the Signory. It's something very similar to the Kievan Rus, right? Poland and Ruthenia were very similar, especially before the Mongol invasions. And even after those, there are some similar patterns that occur. I recently made a video about the Polish and Lithuanian expansion into Ruthenia, which was something actually happening paradoxically through the same peripheral rulers at a point, especially in this case the southeastern ones, pressing towards Galicia, Volhynia. We made those videos about the respective regions, explaining the Polish intervention here and there, mostly competing with Hungary, etc. So there are two dynamics overlapping, the sort of broader national one and the provincial one, which in part go in parallel, at least literally toward the same direction, which was mostly the one of Polish expansion. The 14th century is also a moment of full maturity of the Polish kingdom in the broader, let's say, international scenario. Because of the medieval crisis, generally speaking, most countries re-entrench themselves into a more properly local, regional dimension, boundaries, as, let's say, the previous era, almost universal ambitions. Even I recently made a video about Bohemia that you wouldn't think would have tried to hegemonize literally Germany, the Ordnungsstaat, and the same Poland, but they did, right, under Ottokar II. Poland had sort of different, but by scale, in the sum of all these duchies, sort of similar ambitions. This crisis allows Poland also to consolidate itself, paradoxically also through a further process of oligarchization, but also one of demographic preservation, which apparently was triggered, as we said before, from this country's lucky escape from the Black Death for a reason or another. That in fact would be an important factor in the further expansion of Poland in the later centuries of the Middle Ages, also in the union with Lithuania. And in fact, an impressive expansion eastwards in the following centuries. The Kingdom of Poland at this point forfeited Pomerania and Silesia, the most advanced and economically critical areas of the originally ethnic, at least Slavic, we can say, rather than Polish, because as you know, the Poles were just one tribe, and in the very center of today's Poland. Ironically speaking, the foundation of the Polish kingdom more or less followed the same identical pattern, geographically wise, of today's boundaries of Poland, that, however, towards the later Middle Ages had, as you know, squeezed almost to make the country look like a rhomboid right in this northwestern, southeastern axis. In fact, with more opportunities of expansion in the east, given that the German Ostsiedlung had basically eroded the same Polish territories in the northwest, Pomerania and Silesia, had been heavily Germanized, and in this sense sort of entered the Holy Roman Empire, right, even as previously held Polish territories as lands of conquest that they also, like as Poles, had never fully, quite especially Pomerania, really directly controlled, if not with just military campaigns, occupation, and so on. Silesia was something more hybrid, but it would also remain into the later Middle Ages and even the early modern age a very heavily parceled and sort of frontier area, right, between Germany, Poland, Bohemia, and wouldn't witness the development of a substantial, actively, sort of proactively aggressive power. This forfeited land resulted in half of the Polish population residing beyond the kingdom's boundaries at some point, or at least what you could call as Poland, previously controlled by the Poles. In 1295, the Duchy of Silesia was fragmented into smaller principalities, which would remain again, but we're talking tens of them. We're talking places like Wrocław, Legnica, weakening central control, but also, as we've seen, the provincial one, and facilitating, in fact, German influence, infiltration, as many of these dukes swore fealty to the Bohemian crown by 1327. We were already in Luxembourg's time, so we have a very big deal of sort of broader Germanic, in that case also like essentially Lorrainese influence. Silesia was to remain a quite autonomous land. We've seen it also in the video about the early modern age for the Habsburgic dynastic possessions. Pretty much isolated and normally, not always, but say being a bit outside of the game, of the major games, and hoping to remain isolated in that fashion. The losses in the West were due to the unsuccessful unification attempts by the Silesian PS dukes, by the way, that had tried to maintain their own provincial autonomy, also from the Germans, And in fact, the latter's expansion, their general influence witnessed PS principalities forming dependencies on German political entities that were essentially more powerful than in these individual chunks. We didn't talk so much about this so far, but they were really important because, again, there is a similar pattern happening in other lands east, especially in relation with the Poles, for example. So that's fascinating. And there's a lot of German colonization of these lands. And thus the gradual Germanization of the ruling elites that at some point literally adopt Germanized names, right, from their Slavic background. The Teutonic Order, on top of this, dominated the lower Vistula, which basically prevented the Poles to profit from the largest amount of the same Vistula river trade with the Baltic. It was controlled at the mouth of the river by this powerful state. Like the Teutonic Order is a fully fledged state, right? There isn't something similar, not even in Germany, like a monastic state with incredible central control and immense power that is, by the way, beating the hell out of the Lithuanians in the east that are barely surviving. Mazovia, that is literally like just in the southeast of this, and it has Lithuania in the east, remained outside full integration into the Polish state for the foreseeable future, paradoxically because that's where Warsaw was growing and would eventually become the actual Polish capital, so to say, because Krakow was a bit too exposed to the Hungarians, to the Germans as well. In 1320, Duke Boleslav III of Mazovia swore an oath of vassalage to the King John of Bohemia as well. This is important because, you see, the king was not actually bordering Mazovia. This, however, further delayed Mazovia's incorporation into Poland until the 15th century. By the way, Mazovia was quite powerful. For the times and places, it was a fairly rich principality that simply by winking at the Holy Roman emperors from Bohemia, they could obtain sort of more power and essentially escaping, centrifugally escaping the attempted push of the Polish crown, right, to extend control on its territories. Casimir worked to secure the western and northern frontiers, realizing that the Germanization, of course, was erosive as far as properly Polish independence was concerned. This is a moment of general shrinking, as we've seen, of universal ambitions, but it's not like in Central Europe, the expansion of the German communities through the Ostsiedlung, etc., was to be simply taken so lightly, especially in a country that literally bordered Germany. And it would be interesting, again, to deepen this as well. Charles IV of Bohemia was particularly powerful ruler later on, but also his father held important consideration. He also campaigned as a crusader in the Baltic, following, by the way, on the tradition of the Przemyslids that, as we've seen in the aforementioned video about Ottokar II, had tried, in fact, to infest Poland from Bohemia as well. Casimir sought essentially to reclaim some lost lands as well and mitigated these losses, the aforementioned losses, by expanding eastward, which was the most viable direction instead. It's a bit what the Germans were doing in perspective, right? If you look at Germanic migrations historically, they basically stop. There are some, of course, bulks that enter the Latin world, but they're absorbed by that. But the Germanization from the majority German expand mostly towards the east historically. This was true in Roman times. This was true during the Middle Ages. Equally, the Western Slavs that were more powerful than Eastern Slavs were tending towards the east, the southeast, the Black Sea. I made an entire video explaining essentially what was there to gain about that. And at this point in history, there are ever longer ranged interactions, as a matter of fact. You may think that the crisis brings to the end of those. No, right? The elites strengthened to the point that they can actually extend their own individuals' range of interconnection, because also they are sort of increasingly elevated from the rest of the masses, and so they have this higher level sort of combinations. Here we're looking at the beginning of the of the beginning of the 14th century. So there hasn't been properly the medieval crisis yet. It's still a phase of pseudo-universal ambitions are gradually dying out. In the video about Ottokar II of Bohemia, we have seen we arrived also up to the early 14th century, showing how there was this general sense of fear of the Western Slavs towards the same German expansion. And so we're looking at a time where, say, they would have not really imagined how much the world would have changed just in a couple of generations. Casimir incorporates mostly East Slavic, non-Polish ethnic regions into his realm, so expanding fundamentally towards Ruthenia and the surrounding areas in the west. Think about the Carpathians, that is Moldavia, that is being formed essentially at this point in a well-enucleated way, and the Hungarians claiming control of that, but it's quite far and stretched, and the Poles actually have it easier, because they are from the same side of the Carpathians, at least to descend toward those directions, the Bug River, the fortresses over the Black Sea. There's a lot of Genoese trade going on there, open to the markets of the same Mongols, that in this sense make the Poles acquiring an even greater leverage over Ruthenia, right? We've seen how the Mongols were in crisis at this point, and Lithuania had mostly been profiting from that, but essentially Poland was the stronger country. Hence also the later alliance between these old enemies, as the Teutonic Knights were really becoming too heavy for both of them. Despite the reduction in territory, Poland in the 14th century saw, however, rapid economic growth and rising prosperity. At least in relative terms, if you look at its general place in ranking in Europe, in terms of absolute power, it's not like Poland is particularly sophisticated or qualitative in its production or whatever, but you do witness, especially a great deal of, for example, grain, timber exports, because the Polish populace was not decimated by the plague, and therefore they worked a lot. That was a fundamentally poor economy from the Slavic hinterland that was in part catalyzed by the German towns that the same Poles had, at least as isles under probably within a Slavic sea, that the crown could make more dependent on their own rather than those border regions against a sort of bulkier German hinterland, would allow this pretty big amount of raw materials, especially in times of epidemic of famines, to export this far and wide. And while the Vistula remained blocked and would remain blocked for a long time beyond the 14th century, Poland was very well located in terms of continental trade routes, right? In Central Europe, you had to pass through Poland in a way or another, and especially in the west-east axis, but also the north-south one to a degree. And this, as we've seen, with also a greater elite demand from the other countries, allowed Poland to be ever better sort of set like in this mechanism. This era also witnesses the expansion and sort of further innovation of farming communities, the growth of urban centers. Poland had some of these, even though it was not, of course, a land of Roman urbanization, etc. The general population was sparse, communication was not so much, also agricultural productivity was not particularly high. But overall, by quantity, this is a bit like in Hungary, we've seen it in different videos. The system as a whole does increase, all right? I will not make the comparison between Poland and the West or between Poland and Hungary. I talked a lot about this for Hungary, as a matter of fact, because that's really sort of a slightly different country from even probably the Western Slavic ones, not just ethnically, obviously, but in terms of how it had probably been formed, how, what kind of communities existed, what kind of centers of power they had. The Poles were actually a bit more orderly, right? You can say civilized even to some extent. In Hungary, there was a bit of steppes flavor, etc. Poland does not have the same power of Hungary, but at the same time, it's actually recovering ground in that international ranking as well. There is an increasing prominence in flourishing trade, mining, and metallurgical activities in general. This also thanks to the technological development of the era. But more than else, the actual consolidation of some stattal tax collection capacity that allows the crown to invest even ever more sort of strategically and rationally in particularly profitable sectors for the state, for the crown. By 1360, the development of salt mines in Bochnia and Wieliczka significantly boosted royal revenues, for example, funding infrastructure and military campaigns as well. This obviously follows a normal pattern of societal and political expansion. Poland was not, as we've seen, qualitatively rich, but it had, again, lots of resources, and the medieval crisis that is milder in the country but still happens. By the way, in lands like Poland, where the brutality of the nobility over the peasantry is proverbial, and where, in fact, the peasantry had never really counted that much in general as a whole. The towns were almost all German in terms, at least, of those that actually developed. More so, there was probably a very heavy sense of social stratification and estate hierarchy that witnessed, the Szlachta, the nobility in general, also essentially pursuing these princely policies at the expense of also at least exploiting the situation, as they would have obviously, they were capable of doing at the time, but with relatively primitive and backward preconditions that also fostered a kind of brutality and straightforward means. The Poles behaved that brutally also in Ruthenia, of course, and they didn't definitely use velvet gloves, even at home, you can imagine abroad. A collection of laws aimed at standardizing economic practices across the kingdom was also attempted. Major monetary reform was enacted under Casimir III's rule. In 1364, Casimir introduced a new silver-based currency, the grosz, modeled on the Prague groschen, that at the time were really going strong given the pretty fortunate and powerful reign of Charles IV. I made multiple videos about this ruler that, as you know, is central in probably 14th century Europe. Bohemia is the heart of 14th century Europe, and Poland, in this sense, is partially influenced by such financial trade concentration that this neighboring country. In all this, of course, there was an attempt to stabilize trade, mostly to strengthen the economy with the further means available. It was mostly just trying to get surplus after surplus, and in parallel, say, political investments, military activities would increase in scale, gradually, but still. There were mints established in Krakow and other major cities because more precious metal, in a way or another, was coming to the hands of the Polish kings. This helped stabilizing power a big deal and fostering further growth. As we know, the Jewish settlement in Poland began early on. I made a video about this in Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, etc. And really early, much earlier than, of course, any of these examples we will make now. We're in the 10th century, the 11th, when the Khazar Khanate has been disintegrated by the Kievan Rus, and the Jews arrived from the east in these other countries that you would make, in fact, Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary in the west, that desperately needed some more centralizing capacity because they didn't have even a feudal glue to stabilize the foundation of a state on. And these foreigners helped a great deal to, if anything, to maintain important trade connections. They were invested by the local kings of specific offices, including due to the fact that the Jews were meant to go to hell anyway in the eschatological vision of Christianity, that, however, always protected the Jews because it was a duty, that it was a patronizing sense that the Jews belong to the Christians that have to protect them until the end time, because there must be a non-Christian witness to the second coming of Christ. And so that is actually very important. But in more practical terms, as you know, all over Central Europe, think about the Aufjud of Vienna, etc. The role of the Jews is primarily an administrative one, a governmental one. They could handle money lenders, and having particularly, in fact, delicate affairs taken care on behalf of the local kings, which also fostered historical anti-Semitism from the side of the ethnic nobility that naturally saw in this monarchic attempts at centralization some interference with their affairs. And given that this had witnessed the introduction of foreigners of all kinds from the West in the forms of knights, of priests, and now the Jews from the East largely, not only. There was a general sense of xenophobia and ethnic hostility that, even though quite different from the one of the age of nationalism in the 19th century, was, however, deeply seated in these countries for quite a long time, right? Central Europe has a completely different history, for example, as far as the Jews are related than Western Europe, all right? But a radically different one. And this is partly due, of course, to the weakness of the local institutions. And this means that the local rulers used to stabilize power. In 1264, Duke Boleslav I of Greater Poland issued the Statute of Kalisz, which granted Jews wide-ranging freedoms in religious observance, mobility, and commerce, essentially establishing a Jewish community quarter in your own cities and towns would help maintaining an important financial potential, like cash readily available. Then you would basically compensate, you would subcontract these guys' other activities in order to make more money in exchange for these loans, basically, and expanding their power. This statute set a legal precedent for shielding Jews from local persecution and marginalization, which was really what all lay and ecclesiastical authorities always did throughout the Middle Ages. Basically, every time there was an anti-Jewish pogrom, authority intervened to basically slaughter all these people that were essentially trying to rob the Jews, because there weren't practically many other reasons for enacting this. And in this sense, the local authorities were quite successful and increasing further wealth. The statutes like the one of Kalisz by Duke Boleslav I of Greater Poland exempted the Jews from, for example, enslavement, which was, especially in Central Eastern Europe, like still very much a thing compared to the West. The same goes for serfdom, actually, so all the various shades in the spectrum, and laying the groundwork for their future prosperity within the Polish kingdom. That, as you know, regardless of the... you see, this is not tolerance like in contemporary terms. It's just a form of balance of power, all right? And by the 17th century, 18th century, you know, that Poland was known as the heaven of the Jews, etc., not because the Jews had it particularly well there, in absolute terms, but because, if anything, other countries had expelled them, and the Poles were, Polish kings in particular, trying their best to garner all this kind of emigres. It's a bit like, I don't know, the Huguenots in the Protestant lands. Think about, after the Edict of Nantes, how many French went populating and working in Prussia, for example. That's notoriously a very important demographic and economical mechanism. The Statute of Kalisz also allowed Jews to serve as royal financiers, as we were saying before. So establishing properly this was allowed in their guise and their best, making, of course, these Jews much more dependent on the crown. Managing mints and tax collection, which enhanced their economic influence in urban centers. This precedent was followed by many subsequent legal declarations of similar kind. After a series of expulsions from Western Europe, Jewish communities were founded in Krakow, Kalisz, and other western and southern Polish areas in the 13th century. So there are Jews that come from the West, by the way. France, England, Spain had all basically started expelling them, but different degrees. Naturally, you know, we are in the late Middle Ages. We can't think like a massive sort of eradication or something like that. Absolutely not. So this happened at waves, different points that also helped, in fact, fostering contact with other countries, paradoxically. In the 14th century, further communities were established in Lviv, which, of course, was at that point, there was a part, essentially, of Ruthenia. The Ruthenian Palatinate was under Polish influence, even though most of Ukraine was fundamentally under Lithuania. Right? We talked about this. We'll make more videos about that. Lithuania was ever more drawn to Poland due to the obvious power of the latter. But you have Brest-Litovsk, in fact, Grodno. These are all eastern centers where Jewish communities are established by the Poles. And, because we have made a series about Ukrainian history that historically, say, by the beginning of the 20th century, basically all Ukrainians lived in their vast amount in the countryside, and the towns were in the hands of the Poles and the Jews, hence all the issues that followed later also with the massacres in Galicia, Volhynia. We'll come back talking about that as well. Because it was the measure of a foreign government, and therefore something that had to be eliminated. King Casimir welcomed Jewish refugees from Germany in 1349. That's also interesting because Germany had its own periodical, pogroms. In 1334, Casimir confirmed and expanded the Statute of Kalisz, granting Jews the right to establish their own courts for internal disputes, further solidifying their legal protections. These were all incredibly important things because especially legal liberty equated to an important community development and hierarchy within the same settlements. That, in fact, at this point, start really stratifying, settling in really substantial fashion, right? That had already been the case, but the 14th century witnesses a big deal of further expansion of the Polish Jewry, properly from a numerical point of view, and in this essentially now well-founded social and juridical liberty and identity. Vladislav I, the Elbow High, who reigned between 1305 and 1333, was initially an obscure PS duke from Kuyavia. These are the kind of provinces I want to talk a bit more in depth after we finish with this video, the broader Polish kingdom regional series. We say this because, again, the PS were a bit like the Rurikids, again, in Ruthenia. It's the same thing. You have all these many different branches and houses. We don't even know exactly who they were. I mean, it's not like in 13th, 14th century Poland exactly the genealogy of all the PS dukes from here and there. But anyway, the PS went on for a long time, even when they were not kings of Poland anymore. For example, in Silesia, the PS dukes arrived well into the modern age because they had installed themselves historically from the early Polish conquests in all these places, and mostly maintained due to the generally loose cohesion of the country. Identically like in the Rus, the idea that blood, this higher nobiliar status, was basically the measure of their right to rule. There was a lot of sort of sacred sort of idea of royalty, of leadership. We were noticing it in the past video about Ottokar II. We tend to give it a bit for granted, looking just at social, economical issues, but when you realize from the few sources available what these people actually believed and their actually divine ambitions, and that's a real thing during the Middle Ages, especially even for this sort of more, you can say, not really peripheral fringe, but less sort of modernized and secularized part of Europe, like that, there was a very heavy bulk. It's as if time passed a bit more slowly in these places, and that there's something continuing over time. Vladislav waged a relentless and arduous campaign against formidable opponents with steadfast resolve. Upon his death as king of partially reunified Poland, after a lot of fighting, a lot of brutality, he left the kingdom, however, still in a fragile state. This is also typically Polish, especially in medieval times. Consider that from the beginning of the 13th century, Poland would go under three distinct Mongol invasions of the country within the country, right? The third one will be fully successful violently repelled by the same Poles. But we know, archaeologically speaking, from the 13th century, that was, for example, a heavy blow, as opposed to the 14th century crisis didn't quite affect Poland more than much. We know that entire towns were razed, that eventually there were stone fortifications. There is definitely that process of methods of stills of power conferred more to the elites by broken commoners that were exhausted by all these wars. And as we've seen, Poland itself as a broader state and institution does not quite have a very sound permanent, say, foundation. And as such, after the cyclical waves of reconquest by this different sides in the center of the PS branch, of course, the exhaustion was felt even more. Accomplice in these decades the gradual sliding towards a sort of more critical time in history, greater social impoverishment, again, a greater oligarchization. Though Vladislav's authority was limited and numerous challenges persisted, he may have ensured Poland's survival as a state, and or at least contributed to the eventual cohesion of his kingdom. With the support of his ally Charles I of Hungary, I made a video about 14th century Hungary, about Charles, Vladislav returned from exile and confronted Václav II, that we discussed just recently, as King of Bohemia, and his successor Václav III between 1304 and 1306. This tells you, in a sense, how, of course, this has happened because the Poles have in part backed the Bohemians against him. Again, it was not much of a national issue. It's not like the Bohemians could take over the Poles and ruling them or whatever. But traditionally, like, it's about who this people wants to, people read the nobility in this case, wants to be ruled by. And there are constantly the pro and against faction for each guy. In this case, Vladislav is backed by Hungary, that realizes that also an engulfed Poland is not necessarily too much of a thing. Also considering the historical attritions, to say between Hungary and Bohemia, that we illustrated again also in that video about Ottokar II and the attempts to even bring Ruthenian candidates on the Austrian throne because of the Babenberg succession. The Poles, at least at the time, had eventually ended up backing Ottokar II, but in general that had always been some sort of distrust, and that was what the video was about, this constant back and forth depending on this or that ruler, this or that policy, this or that campaign, that today we can't fully see, but that's why we make the more in-depth videos. Now, the assassination of Václav III in 1306 ended the Bohemian Przemyslid dynasty's involvement in Poland, also because the Przemyslid dynasty ended, so that was just something to begin with. And Vladislav then captured Lesser Poland, entering Krakow, which was, as we've seen, in the crowning principality, conferring the seniorate of Poland, therefore the full legitimacy to as kings. Vladislav thus manages to extend his control further northward through Kuyavia, that, as we've seen, he also had come from, but at some point he had lost, to Gdansk, Pomerania, which is, we have to make a video about medieval Pomerania because it's an incredibly messed up history, much more than you imagine. And if anything, as we've seen, the Polish problem was always having an outlet on the Baltic, because they were essentially just a continental power, a terrestrial one, with this constant dependency on essentially the Germans for more international trading opportunities, at least with the more profitable ones. And Pomerania was at least destabilized enough region to attempt a breakthrough when, say, as a Polish ruler, you had enough power. In 1308, however, the Margraves of Brandenburg seized Pomerania, which shows who was actually the stronger in the area. I made a video about the Margravate of Brandenburg if you're interested in that. And again, we have really to make a video about Pomerania to bridge many lands across the Baltic here. In an attempt to recover Pomerania once again, because that was also a Polish thing, extending control over Pomerania, the Germans, the Danes, somebody else, like essentially the same Pomeranians, rebelling and or pushing the Poles out. Vladislav enlisted for the task the Teutonic Knights, which obviously had their own territorial ambitions. This was a form of proxy war, and that some of them actually served the Polish king, because remember that the Teutonic state was actually a vassal of the kings of Poland. They had began their journey in Poland properly by sub-infeudation from the Dukes of Mazovia, but in that sense as properly Polish vassals under the king. And the Teutonic Knights, as you know, were not equipped with a particularly high sense of human mercy, so they ruthlessly took Gdansk, that, as you know, would become also historically big of an object of contention for the Poles, the Germans, and not only. Gdansk, Pomerania, and kept it for themselves, though, which was also kind of the unavoidable outcome of this, because how do you actually dislodge the Teutonic Knights? That's the Polish meme issue, right? And look at this, because you have all this northwestern arc, and also up to the northeast, as we've seen with the Vistula Mount, that is all basically in the hands of the Germans. And so, even though, of course, wars did not really improve much the local conditions of anyone, at least you could try to put one of your enemy against the other by conferring, in this case, from royal authority, at least some right to some lands that in theory belonged, in fact, to the Kingdom of Poland, like Pomerania. In 1309, the Teutonic Knights, by the way, massacred much of Gdansk's Polish population, which, again, adds yet another touch of, gentleness from the side of the Ordensstaat, and what we're showing what their feelings were already at the time towards the Slavic Untermenschen in their view. And this is a real thing, right? What I said before about the Polish Szlachta treating, peasants like dirty animals is exactly what, in parallel, the Teutonic Knight, the Germans in general thought about the Slavs. And I would like to stress how radical the divide between these two cultures was at the time, at least by Central European standards. We're not light years away, but definitely the Germans were incredibly more performing in the East. And that's also why the same Slavic rulers had invited them over to settle, to support local trade. Think about the Magdeburg Law arriving up to Ukraine, etc. So there is really a lot going on in terms of, as I was saying before, this is not a peaceful multicultural coexistence. This is pure brutality exercised to maintain some kind of balance in an incredibly messed up and perennially unstable situation. By the way, the Teutonic Order replaced the Polish population of Gdansk with German settlers, which solidified their control over Danzig, so the region now, as they fully consolidated their presence in it. Between 1311 and 1312, a rebellion in Krakow, led by the city's patrician elite that naturally didn't like too much to be hegemonized by a king. Similar things happened with the Parisian merchants during the 100 Years' War towards the French crown. And who sought governance by the House of Luxembourg, so literally hoping, like in the case of the French, that the kingdom would fail, like that the whole thing would collapse, so that they could remain this big city. Krakow was the largest city in Poland. Sort of in a fragmented, decentralized area where they could simply mind their own economical business, and meaning this sort of fat mercantile center, which is never, by the way, what things normally end up like, for real. We just mentioned Danzig, that, as we've seen also in our videos about 16th, 17th century Polish-Lithuanian warfare, was a free German city, at least in their mindset, cooperating with the Polish kingdom maintaining, of course, an important commercial relevance, having a robust militia on their own, etc., but definitely not being able at that point to essentially emancipate themselves further from greater state building, right? So whenever the situation is destabilized, somebody else takes over in worse ways. Also, trade does not actually work that well, at least as long as there is war around, which is at that point basically endemic. You see also in this case that the House of Luxembourg, remember here we are well before Charles IV, we're at the time of Henry VII, that is in Italy by now, and will die actually the following year. So it's not like they were asking to the Bohemian army to march into Poland. By the way, Henry, made his home fight mostly at the head of French and German knights from the opposite side of fact of the Holy Roman Empire. So that's also it's not like not even the Krakowian patriciate will have this enormous capacity to emancipate themselves from the monarchy. Again, they were rich by Polish standards, but in a country as we've seen, it was not really oriented towards simply other dukes sitting there, allowing Krakow to remain an independent center. In fact, this rebellion is quashed and utter blood running. This event likely hindered the growing political influence of urban centers as well, because obviously, given this generalized growth of urban centers, also that were ruled all by this dukes historically, like by the PS blood and so on, began to look at the patricians as possible antagonists of the nobility, and so there was a further authoritarian character of the Polish rule reinforced at this point, right? The rebellion's leader, by the way, Major Albert, this is a German name, was executed. Of course, there was some connection of that kind, right? It's like for Bohemia, we've seen it for the Hussites. You can't say that it was a national struggle against the Germans or something, but there were historically intersections, and especially the ones between the monarchy, paradoxically, and the Germans that the rest of the ethnic nobility did not quite like. This Albert is executed, and Vladislav imposes heavy fines on Krakow's elites, weakening their authority. So at least in this case, they had tried to go against the king, asking to another king for protection, but not going much anywhere. In 1313, 1314, Vladislav secured Greater Poland as well. In 1320, he was the first Polish king crowned at Wawel Cathedral in Krakow rather than Gniezno, with reluctant approval from Pope John XXII, despite opposition from King John of Bohemia, who also claimed the Polish crown. This is interesting, by the way, because at the time, the Pope and the Luxembourgs had come a bit closer, because initially John was the son of Henry VII. They had definitely despised one another, but there is, at this point, mostly Ludwig the Bavarian that creates problems, so the Luxembourgs become temporary allies. And in fact, the Pope is not really happy that Vladislav is gaining this enormous power just next door to Bohemia, right? Hence also all those machinations of the patriciate, the Germans, Major Albert, and so on. Without mentioning that John of Bohemia, for quite complicated feudal reasons, also claimed the Polish crown. I will not get into that topic because it's well worth another video, but historically, and there had been this much intricate and not obvious sort of intersection of Polish and Bohemian affairs from centuries, actually, that would always witness the most powerful rulers attempting to claim some rights over each other's lands. John, which also will prelude, by the way, to an actual situation later on in the Middle Ages where Central European monarchies at some point would be ruled by single rulers, that in that case is more like consequence of some royal intermarriage after the crisis. to reinforce their elite position and allowing at least to get surplus from different countries at a time for consolidating power only in one, right, with a decentralized position of the nobility in the others, which definitely did not help the development of these monarchies that all essentially explode into ineffective elective systems. John launches an expedition towards Krakow in 1327. This happened also at the end of Ludwig the Bavarian's expedition to Italy. However, this move fails, right? John is forced to abandon his Polish campaign. In 1328, he waged a crusade against Lithuania, however, to reinforce, as we've seen, the Bohemian standing in the Baltic. John was notoriously an errant knight more than a king. He would die blind, fighting blind at the Battle of Crecy, right, from the French side, where also the young Charles, his son, was almost killed in combat as well. And they had been fighting in Italy as well. Charles would go back there multiple times. So you understand that they were almost everywhere, but at least, especially John, but in Prague, right? In looking at Bohemian affairs, well, Charles will very well, by the way, too. This move of the crusade in Lithuania formalizes an alliance with the Teutonic Order as well, which, as we've seen, historically was a pawn of the Bohemian crown, in particular after the failure of the German national monarchy. So the most sort of obvious interlocutor in Central Europe would be the Bohemians, also because, like in these years from 1327 to 1332, the Teutonic Order was at war with the same Poland, right? So they, at that point, would be natural allies against the latter. There's also the Battle of Plovdiv. The Teutonic Order captures Dobrzyn and Kujawia. This is relevant because we also made a video about the Order of Dobrzyn. Kujawia, as we've seen, was the same ancestral land of Vladislav. So these are brutal wars. Like, we don't really talk too much about them in the bigger pictures, as if, countries just sit there doing nothing. But there is an incredibly intricated situation here. And there were not even particularly small battles. At least we know of thousands of knights from both sides. So these are also interesting videos topics for the future. In this battle fought in 1331, Vladislav forces achieved a tactical victory, capturing 56 Teutonic knights, though the order retained control of the disputed territories. At this point, Vladislav was aided by alliances with Hungary. His daughter Elizabeth wed King Charles I in 1320. In Lithuania, through a 1325 pact against the Teutonic state and the marriage of his son Casimir to Aldona, daughter of Lithuanian ruler Gediminas. This shows, by the way, how all these countries were fundamentally, Lithuania was just playing his own game of survival, telling the truth. But, for example, Hungary was historically a rival of Bohemia, and did not really like the fact that the Luxembourgs were getting all that power interference. So decided to, and especially like in a broader sense, you can extend it also to Lithuania. All these powers were aware of the fact of what is going on in a broader system, and playing at a large scale sort of chess system. They realized that if an axis became too robust, it could create problem for everybody involved. And it's very interesting to look, of course, at medieval power and how fluid and long range it actually was, and it wasn't just a merely local thing, telling the truth. The 1325 alliance with Lithuania included a mutual defense agreement against the Teutonic Order, formalized in the same Vilnius, strengthening Poland's eastern flank. This was a big deal because the Lithuanians had historically been enemies of Poland. They had been raiding the country as much as the Prussians had done. And they had remained there. At this point, they're still not Christianized. They are a sort of an awkward neighbor to begin with. But they had maintained relations with the papacy. They were playing their own game as well, and especially expanding a big deal into Ruthenia and contending the area to the Mongols in a condition of power sharing. As we've seen, the Poles are also gradually heading toward the Black Sea. So there are shared sort of ambitions and sort of systems that are to eventually, if not properly merge, but at least consolidate along the same coordinate of expansion. A peace agreement with Brandenburg after 1329 further bolstered Vladislav's efforts to require sort of international force and especially breaking the sort of encirclement, as we've seen. A major setback for Poland was, however, King John of Bohemia's success in securing the loyalty of most Silesian PS principalities, offering wavering in their allegiance between 1327 and 1329. Silesia was a pretty thorny land. It was incredibly difficult to simply rule it. And also in this case, it's not like the Bohemians fully directly occupied, controlled the area. However, the local establishment sided with the Luxembourgs to escape the centripetal force of the Polish crown. In 1329, the Duchy of Głogów became a Bohemian fief proper, so there was probably a formalization of direct vassalic dependency, marking a significant loss of Polish influence in the province. After Vladislav I's death, his 23-year-old son became King Casimir III. All right, I made a video about, as we were saying before, Casimir III's reign, which was pretty long and also for stabilizing the country. In fact, Casimir will come to be known as the Great, ruling between 1333 and 1370. Lots of things changed in the meanwhile. Imagine being born in 1310. Right, and it's a bit like a great contemporary to St. Charles IV. We've seen the same Charles IV's life as a parabola encompasses the whole 14th century. And again, being born at the beginning of the century and dying at the end, it is to witness like two different eras in the history of mankind in a lifetime. Unlike his father Vladislas, Casimir had no taste for the demands of military campaigns. At least he found himself in a relatively stabilized position. Of course, he was raised in general as a leader, of men, and of course, it was just those times leaders' duty to be up to war and fighting, etc. But he preferred also different paths, considering that he was favored by the shrinking of powers in all around Poland due to the 14th century crisis exactly in these decades. I often refer to the mid-14th century crisis that in my studies, as you know, I studied the 14th century, especially the first part, and I honestly think that it had a much greater impact than we normally think, and counterintuitively also not necessarily putting an end to medieval civilization, but conferring it some characteristic that made it at least capable of lasting as an ancien regime for many centuries and allowing also for further re-expansion. It was not a positive thing, but as we've seen, Poland also came out of it relatively unscathed, say with those characteristics of the era that were more conducive to a power consolidation of the broader countries like Poland. Casimir's contemporaries were skeptical of his very ability to tackle the kingdom's escalating problems or succeed as a ruler, because, of course, it's not like the age of troubles was over, really. Yet Casimir acted with caution and wisdom from the start, acquiring King John of Bohemia's claims to the Polish throne in 1335. There was an agreement signed at the Congress of Visegrad, witnessing Casimir paying 20,000 Prague groschen to secure John's renunciation of Polish claims. That is a fair diplomatical resolution to this old issue. it's again a time of already sort of crisis eruption where the system is exhausted. The Bohemians realistically understand that there is nothing to do in terms of actually coming to rule in Poland at that point. If anything, it would have required too much investment, too many wars, and so on. However, they would not abandon their claim until at least somebody paid for it, which would settle the matter, which sort of satisfied both sides anyway. So this shows Casimir's kind of diplomatic wisdom. In 1343, he also settled several high-level disputes with the Teutonic Order through a territorial compromise formalized in the Treaty of Kalisz, regaining the aforementioned Dobrzyn and Kujawia. This is interesting as well because the Teutonic Order is suffering similar issues. The Treaty of Kalisz required Poland to relinquish claims to Pomerania in exchange for peace and the return of the contested lands. So this restabilization, you understand here, we are in the 40s, so we're just entering that phase of full sort of broader exhaustion. Nobody feels like getting into bigger things anymore, right? There is probably an internal redefinition of power. You can argue that, I don't know, the Ottomans are expanding, but this is not quite, first of all, it would take a while before that became also so more serious than it actually was. And we'll talk more about that, if anything, in our series about Balkan history. But it's all a moment of general resentment and strengthening on the basis of new foundations. Between 1340 and 1366, Casimir expanded eastward further. All right, he annexed the Halych-Volodymyr region of Rus. All right, we talked about this in our videos about Galicia, Volhynia, that at this point basically fully entered in the orbit of Poland. All right, these countries also had been sort of going back and forth in terms of protectorates from Poland, from Hungary. In the town of Lviv drew settlers of various nationalities. Was granted municipal rights in 1356 and therefore emerged as Lwów in Polish, a key, in fact, now increasingly Polonized hub within a Rus Orthodox population. Although these lands were also particularly aligned with papal negotiations and would turn out to become sort of Catholic, Greek Catholic, and maintaining a bit like the honored broader Ruthenian Palatinate as incredibly prestigious lands. The Lithuanians themselves were expanding, as we've seen, in the central and eastern part of Ukraine. In 1340, Casimir secured Halych through a military intervention, showing that he was also up to a fight when, of course, the instrument of war was profitable to employ. This happened at the death of Boleslav I, so exploiting a power vacuum in the region. Backed by Hungary, Casimir promised the Hungarian ruling house the Polish throne in 1338 should he die without male heirs. This is also particularly relevant because what kind of succession would be triggered in this, as the Angevins will come to rule in Poland. Right. By the way, there were different pretendants to the Polish throne even there, but if anything, it's something we will see better at the end of this video, and also in distinguished ones, because it's a very interesting crossroad. Things could have gone there, as in other countries like Lithuania, in different ways, in some of the most climatic connections, passing through marriages at the end of the 14th century. The issues with Bohemia were not over, by the way. Casimir, who formally surrendered claims to several Silesian principalities in 1339, as we've seen, try to appease the Luxembourgs, made however, still unsuccessful attempts to reclaim the region through military campaigns against his Bohemian neighbors. We are between 1343 and 1348. This is interesting because, of course, these lands were at hand and they would historically remain contended between the two areas. If anything, mirroring that sort of failed state kind of situation that was producing itself at this point with the crisis of the Black Death. Casimir later thwarted Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV to detach the Saint Silesia from the Gniezno Archdiocese, which was another, again, secondary mean to basically snatch this land away, because, of course, if you separate, even aside from the broader lay conquests that were a bit problematic, you rearrange the ecclesiastical administration of certain regions by saying, okay, this land falls into this metropolitic authority rather than another. You could sort of favor a process of further autonomization and fall into another power's orbit, right? The church was also powerful in this context as well, and very feudalized, at least very privatized, very oligarchic, like the lay nobility. The same Charles IV, which naturally was endowed with a very powerful authority, pursued Poland's claim to Silesia legally by appealing to the Pope until his death, though his successors did not actually continue these efforts, if anything, because, as we've seen, the situation was sort of complicating, especially in Bohemia. Again, more of this, the Hussites will follow at some point. In 1345, Casimir's forces briefly occupied the same Wrocław in Silesia, but were repelled by Bohemian troops, marking a failed attempt to regain the province militarily. Allied with Denmark and Western Pomerania, because the part with Danzig in the east was ceded to Teutonic Order as quote-unquote in the treaty as an eternal charity, Casimir adjusted the western frontier as well. All right, it managed to sort of consolidate some, in this case also Scandinavian influence in the region. It's not like Denmark was faring too well, especially in the following decades. In any case, there was still some attempt to infiltration that would prevent like further stabilization in Western Pomerania by some more powerful neighbor. In 1365, Dresdenko and Santok became Poland's fiefs as well. And in 1368, the Walch district was taken outright, cutting off the land connection between Brandenburg and the Teutonic state, thus linking Poland with farther Pomerania. These machinations, if you look at them on a map, are quite interesting. They are basically the product of a rationalization of a sort of strategic intervention in areas that were not particularly stable, exploiting power vacuums. And again, we are in the heat of the crisis. Like the following, the 50s, the 60s are some of the toughest decades in the century. And the 1368 annexation of Walch followed probably a campaign that against the Margraves of Brandenburg and secured a strategic corridor for Polish trade routes in the process, hopefully again vying for the Baltic without further interference, even though it was just a sort of a secondary achievement. Casimir the Great also greatly fortified Poland's standing domestically, not just internationally. At home, he unified and concentrated the power of the Polish crown, promoting the idea of, in fact, the crown of the Polish kingdom in very explicit fashion, which was a relatively new concept. I mean, we never really talked about this. If you study Kantorowicz, you will find really a lot of this stuff in terms of how properly the concept of the crown as a sort of hypothesis of power was being increasingly consolidated, at least from a juridical, from an institutional point of view, right? To stress the existence of a broader state that exists in its unity beyond the the individual rulers. At least there is a king that basically never dies, and different almost officials in the form of actual earthly rulers that cover that wear that crown, right? This concept is quite interesting because it shows how Poland was naturally sensitive to some particular royal ideology and theory was developing also in countries like France and England in the most consistent fashion. It is in and of itself a bit the product of the crisis that obviously triggers some kind of modernization and secularization. But at the same time, in fact, Poland, again, also suffered over the crisis. And so the idea of conferring power to a higher authority that could save your problems, basically, in a moment of great destabilization seemed sort of viable for many. It was obviously always a consensual thing to an extent. I mean, it was enforced also with violence. But as long as you're still alive and you can't bear arms, you don't fight, you're basically conferring that power yourself indirectly. And this was used by Casimir also in a territorial sense, not just in a political one. There was a more outlined kingdom of Poland, also on the map of Europe, so to say, that was recognized with its jurisdiction, with its political extension, and under the rule of a crown. Casimir established or strengthened nationwide institutions such as a powerful state treasury, independent of regional estate or royal court interests. As we've seen, the Jews had been instrumental to that. And in any case, the strengthening of the crown made it easier really to collect taxes, to exact tolls, also in the more peripheral areas. In 1364, Casimir founded the Krakow Academy, later the famous Jagiellonian University, that would train administrators and clergy, enhancing the kingdom's governance. There was a lot of influence from the parallel Luxembourg rule, right, with Prague. And again, if you read that video, you listen to that video about Charles IV, you'll appreciate, of course, that the level of power concentration was in turn inspired, for example, from France, where Charles had been raised. And of course, like Casimir and Charles are just contemporaries, and they are at the head of these powerful kingdoms in Central Europe for an extended amount of time. The Hungarians had powerful rulers in the 14th century, but not quite this continuum at the heart of it. And so this helped in the broader sense. With the weakening of the neighbors because of the broader crisis, Casimir exploited, as we've seen, the situation diplomatically. He was quite exceptionally active in that sense, fostering close relationships with other European rulers and vigorously defending Polish interests. In 1364, he also convened, when, as we've seen, found in the Krakow Academy, the Congress of Krakow, which would be attended by several monarchs of Europe, which aimed to foster peaceful cooperation and political stability, especially in Central Europe. The crisis helps, even paradoxically, this, and the Congress of Krakow specifically included Emperor Charles IV, King Louis of Hungary, Duke Rudolf IV of Austria. These are all incredibly powerful rulers and quite important ones historically. Rudolf IV, as you know, elevated Austria to an archduchy, also founded the University of Vienna. There are very similar things happening all over Central Europe under the edges of this great, sort of enlightened rulers for the times that were also recognizing, as we were saying before, in the moment of the crisis, each other as increasingly sort of mutually relatable and dependable on, meaning that, again, if a concept of crown had to be defended, they could all act as monarchs to do so in their respective kingdoms. And this is, again, incredibly important because it shows between, again, Poland, Bohemia, Austria, Hungary, exactly those countries that would have shared rulers in the following generations, also by intermarriage, as we would see now better in each other's lineages, to at least an important degree preserving at least the solidity of some of their country's powers, regardless of the fact of the elective nature of the same and the constraints placed on the crown by the noblemen. This also happens with the background of the Ottoman advances we were hinting at before. In fact, Central Europeans were particularly sensitive to, of course, like the expansion of the Turks in the Balkans. Hungary was the most directly affected, but it's obvious that the general connections with the Italian maritime republics, the affirmation of Turkish piracy and the control of some Aegean avamposts were all pretty worrying, right? After all, these rulers, as we've seen, just wanted things to proceed smoothly. The Ottoman advances were a problem for the entire Christendom, and given that they were all traditional leaders, they understood the necessity of crusade that, as you know, will also be waged at the end of the century with the dreadful end of Nicopolis, but still proving that there would be an actual commitment to that, which is often said up. The Westerners left Constantinople alone, but well, not quite, right? There were substantial efforts throughout all this history, even in ways that not just could have objectively thwarted the Ottoman expansion, that could have easily been stopped with even minimal interventions at times, like the Ottoman Civil War followed to the Battle of Ankara, those kind of things, from the side of the Venetians, the Hospitallers, and so on. But that really evidently preoccupied these rulers to wage war in faraway places just for the also of their own prestige, their own name, but still also for the broader purpose of a Christian unity. And it would be very interesting, just as we were talking about this, well, also the Crusades in the Baltic and so on, how deeply traditional even the later Crusades were, how much continuity mindset. Remember, these guys were born at the beginning of the 14th century, so at the beginning of that great universal civilization that still witnessed like an idea of crusade and imperial power that was fully in line with a proactive approach also for the re-expansion of Christendom, as opposed to the sort of more defeatistic negative idea that we have of the Crusades later on, or even, without even realizing that Crusades went on until the 18th century, and they haven't really told you that in school. Let's say, there are, here Poland is mostly in friendly terms with Hungary. It's not like they had an antagonism or competitive issues with one another. But especially with a strong Bohemia, that would have been a sort of obvious consequence. In fact, this Hungarian-Polish alliance endured for 12 years before dissolving into further, conflict. Following Louis of Hungary's death in 1382 and a power struggle that sparked the Greater Poland Civil War, which was a big deal in terms of, in fact, shattering what had been successfully obtained by rulers like Casimir III, the Polish nobility selected Jadwiga, so Louis' youngest daughter, as the next king, literal king, Rex of Poland, because she was basically the heiress to the same Polish crown. And as such, they could sort of guide her, because the sense is that they were protecting her. You remember that concept we said about the crown as an hypostasis. So she held the title of King of Poland, not because she was the king, but because she was the vessel of that, right? And her protectors were the Polish noblemen. In 1383, they decided to crown Jadwiga, literally at a council in Sieradz, rejecting Hungarian regency claims that naturally had immediately arisen as soon as, of course, that deal that had been carried out with the marriage, with the Polish-Hungarian marriage, was concerned. Jadwiga arrived in 1384 and was crowned at age 11. Right. The collapse of the Polish-Hungarian Union set the stage for the union of Lithuania and Poland instead. This is something we will see better in another video, but we also, in fact, need, because there are some dynastic subtleties and a bit of Lithuanian history as well that we must expound before getting a bit more into the midst of that. But of course, a fully different era was opening after this otherwise quite stabilizing parenthesis for the times and the places standards that we will have to, in fact, approach better also with other videos, especially about Casimir the Great, that is, in fact, one of the greatest rulers in Polish history. What to say? Again, it's almost incredible that we miss so much of 14th century Poland. You never sort of make enough videos, really. And here my playlist counts at least about medieval Poland, because we made also some modern Polish history videos. Medieval Poland, this would be essentially the 21st video. Too few, by the way. Also for Hungary. It feels like for Bohemia we often made like a fair share of content, but for Poland that is bigger, there's always a sense that it's too few, right? Here medieval Bohemia 28 videos, so just a bit more. In Hungary really a few, I think just like half of that. It's something, well, no, we're more or less there. 18 medieval Hungary, however, includes, we talked too few about the Magyars, by the way, and I made a video about 14th century Hungary, so I was referencing to that in this video, as I remember that, of course. And again, it always feels, even after all these videos, that we made too few, frankly. I am also planning to start something about, say, medieval rulers, because when you exhaust the single regions, per se, as a broader political history, I think it's a good idea to start looking at individual rulers, and some are really important. I mean, I'm very fascinated with Ludwig the Bavarian. That is one of my, I can say, favorite rulers in absolute terms. But for example, we made videos about Bavaria, but hardly ever about this later phase. Medieval Germany, late medieval Germany lacks. We made lots of videos about Germany, I think more than 100, right? So comparatively. But for example, about the later Middle Ages, in particular like the 14th and 15th century, too few, really. Made lots about Bavaria, like 7 videos so far, at least it would have deserved also more. And again, it's not this linear political history of the whole Dutch, if not for, in fact, the single video on the original series that I made on them, on it. But again, something more about individual rulers, especially Ludwig. It's just like we mentioned him before, like Rudolf IV of Austria. That's yet another great ruler. We made videos about Charles IV. Those came also by themselves. They didn't quite. No, I think for 14th century Bohemia, I made a video about Charles' reign alone, right? So there is also more to do. And John of Bohemia is an interesting figure. Also, Henry VII. They have to do similar things for other countries as well. Scandinavia. We did, if anything, something similar to this for England, because at some point, especially for Edward I, at some point it becomes a history of kings. Like England has, of course, some sub-provinces, but historically it's a quite compact country. It's different. It's sort of difficult to make specifically sort of local stories of the country just per se, other than the monarchic ones. But for example, France, that is big and huge. You can make all the videos about all the different provinces. Also, we didn't make so many videos about the kings of France, and it seems as if there was this empty. For medieval Iberia, we talked a bit more about individual dynasties. At least we ended up telling that history from probably a dynastic fashion that is also kind of obvious for the land. We also never talked, I think, about single Italian rulers. I mean, just the other day I made a video about Lorenzo the Magnificent, but it's also because it was the series about the second half of the 15th century Florence. But otherwise, single condottieri, single especially the later ones of the 15th century that belonged actually to already ruling houses and just became condottieri, at least in a military business hired by other parties. We never talk about the Gonzaga, for example. In 2,500 videos, it seems almost unbelievable, right? There is a lot, really, about the same Savoy, for example. We made a couple of videos about Savoy, I think, but we really never observed, like, I don't know, the Green Count, the Red Count, the White Count, all those stories. They are beautiful, right? They're really of errant knightly rulers, right? Just like John of Bohemia. And it's difficult really to enter we're not talking about all the various houses of England and France during 100 years. I mean, there is so much, right? You can't, it's difficult at this point to even choose what you want to do. But fortunately, we do not lack, we have just the embarrassment of the choice, per se. So I really see in the future an ever greater amount of sort of variation of some sort, at least not much in theme, but in kind of narrative. Because again, if we start making dynastic history, things are going to be slightly different from the rest. I'm glad, however, that we reachieved a bit more views recently. I don't have to make other specific announcements, even though I'm working behind the scenes in different ways for enhancing a bit like the channel. And again, I think we're doing fairly well. We could always do better, but we also arrived to the point at which we can't complain more than much. I'm trying to make this channel ever more, at least by topic, unique but consistent, like not just talking to talk, but walking to walk. I mean, for example, the traditional insight that I offer at some point must be explained also through a strictly historical lens, to prove that it's not fantasy, that it's not just a fashion ideology. Because most people really fall into that trap. Like the last video I made about the Bohemian hegemonization of great part of Central Europe there, especially with Ottokar II. We'll see it better in the series that I started about the Battle of Markfeld from my master thesis, is quite eloquent. These guys truly and really believed in their sacred royalty. And my suspect is that the Slavs had something closer that wasn't fully documented, because they, generally speaking, like most of it was the clergy, that the times had historically changed from sort of the most pushed forms of at least ancestral life into that kind of style, let's say. But I think that there is so much symbolism also in coat of arms. I made a video about Balkan heraldry that shows some very, very interesting things anthropologically speaking. You can feel it. You can feel it from their art if you visit their museums. In Prague, yes, also, but in Warsaw, I was particularly struck by the sense of martyrdom, the sense of blood shedding. That's all something incredibly archaic and properly evidently belonging to the ethnos there. Those are forms that are partly revived also because of the crisis, but that historically pertain to a very specific sense of the sacrifice of the myth of the blood properly, and the doctrine of transfiguration true. The enemy sacrifice, the sacrifice of the self, of course, and all those transcendental intuitions. But again, we must make multiple videos to fully expound this, because otherwise it remains just some sort of where did you see it? And I like this because honestly, I see it the more I make videos on the topic. Like it's difficult for me at this point to deny these things, like saying, oh, maybe it's just an hypothesis. No, it's there. It's there. And I think that I'm going to dedicate myself ever more as a historian and as a YouTuber to this, because in my opinion, it is incredibly relevant, and we should really talk much more about it than we normally do, right? There's going to be probably a phase of intensified specials for different reasons, so we don't go too much by the cycle now. It's not a problem. However, we're satisfied with our current situation. I have plenty of in advance videos to make. We worked hard. We are also managed again to make plenty of new actual videos, not just the preparation for material. For me going to vacations, which I do. I don't tell you when that happens because I don't think it's useful, but just know it happens, right? And there is a lot of work behind that. And my book is going well. I count of finishing it probably even within this year, because I don't think it's going to be particularly difficult. It's unfortunate that you still don't know who I am and that I can't share this with you, but I can assure you that, where or another it enters the work, right? I also talk about my fields of specialization, times and places. I just don't tell you which ones they are, right? But again, there is plenty of very good content arriving from the cycle that is obviously it's never sidelined. I would like to resume von Clausewitz's series at some point. We'll see how things go. I'm pursuing views, larger amount of watch length of followers, because otherwise I don't think more people would keep watching, because unfortunately that series doesn't. I mean, everybody has watched the first episode, but what about the rest? It's always the same thing, unfortunately, with YouTube. You make a lot of good stuff, but it's not necessarily it is understood as such from the other side. It's also, of course, my own limits. It's always one's responsibility at the end of the day. Well, I'm very glad to have made the specific video. So for Poland, I think we will move towards, again, what we've seen now, Kuyavia. I wanted to make a video about that, about Mazovia, about Pomerania. We talked about Silesia, but Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, we really need to do a lot in that sense. And there's also the talking about the Abodrites, talking about different, also migration era Slavic peoples. Never really done that too much. Nevertheless, let's simply go on with this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.